Welcome, everybody. Good evening. It's lovely to have you with us for another edition of In Conversation Live. Well, tonight we have the Sally and Jonathan show. And just to introduce you, although Sally Davies hardly needs an introduction, Sally is a British physician and academic administrator. She was the Chief Medical Officer for England and the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Department of Health, but worked as a clinician specializing in the treatment of diseases of the blood at the Central Middlesex Hospital. And she was appointed a Master at Trinity College, Cambridge, and she's speaking to us today from the Master's Lodge, which is rather beautiful. Sally, welcome. So Jonathan Jonathan Pearson-Stuttard is only 32. He's a public health physician and an epidemiologist at Imperial College London. He completed his medical training at the University of Oxford and has been awarded multiple competitive clinical academic research positions at the Wellcome and NIHR. He's got two streams of research: non-communicable disease epidemiology using big data and simulation modeling, and investigating increasing multi-morbidity and diversification of patients with chronic diseases such as diabetes. And importantly, this duo, dynamic duo, shall we call them, have just written a book and published in November by Oxford University Press. And have you got a copy of it there, Sally, to show us? Just hold it up there. There you go. Whose health is it anyway, is the topic of the book. So we will, I think, on this program, we'll talk a lot about that book, but let's just start with a little bit of background. And I think we'll, Jonathan, we'll start with you because you're not quite as well known as Sally, but they tell me that you're destined to become even better known than her over the years. We'll have to see how you do. So Jonathan, tell us a little bit more about you, about why you went into public health as opposed to, you know, on the battlefield dealing with all these patients like the rest of us. Tell us that.
Thanks, Roger, and thanks very much for having me. So, as you said, I trained in Oxford and did my foundation jobs there. And throughout my time, both in medical school, but then in my foundation jobs, I was always very interested in the epidemiology and initially in cardiovascular disease. And why we had seen such great improvements in mortality rates, the commonest causes of death like heart disease and stroke. And through that, then I learned the importance of the roles of things like salt, of different types of fats, and of smoking, these risk factors that are very much outside of the hospital. And then throughout my public health training, I sort of combined the clinical aspects with this academic approach of what's the data telling us about these risks, and then adding on top of that a sort of policy layer so we can play the what if questions. And in fact, the first time that I met Sally was when we'd done some of this policy modeling research saying for a type of fat called trans fats, if we were to reduce trans fats in certain foods, what would the health impacts be, but also the economic consequences and how that would affect inequalities. And so that was part of my journey along towards public health. And I've really enjoyed that transition in trying to be very applied in how we take data to sort of changing the public's health today.
Great. Then Sally, let's go to Sally. Sally, tell us a little bit. You were a Birmingham girl, weren't you? You went to Edgbaston High School, I believe. And,
Yes.
And then you went to Manchester. So tell us a little bit about that background and what attracted you in the end to come down to London.
Well, as you said, I studied in Manchester. I did a couple of years. I gave up medicine, actually, because I found it, and I think it's been talked about, quite brutalizing, and the rationing that we experienced. I didn't like saying that people couldn't even try renal dialysis, for instance. And I married a diplomat and went off to live in Spain for 4 years as a diplomat's wife. I did speak fluent Spanish. I cook quite well. I ski. I learned all sorts of things, but I missed Spanish. I missed medicine, actually. So I came back into medicine and we came back to London. And I lost the husband, but I gained a passion for medicine and realized that I wanted to do it.
Mm-hmm. And Jonathan, go back to you. Just show us a copy of that book again. Have you got it in front of you?
Yeah.
Because you were just telling me there's some exciting news that some of the contents are going to be featured in the Sunday Times. Just tell us a little bit about what's going to happen on Sunday.
We hope so. So when I worked for Sally in 2018 and edited her annual report, the Chief Medical Officer's 2018 annual report, the report was based in looking to the future and actually repositioning health as an asset instead of illness as a drain. So the main recommendation from that report from Sally was that the Cabinet Secretary should commission the Office for National Statistics to develop a new composite health index. And the idea was that this captures health as an asset, so outcomes in health, but also those risk factors and the wider drivers that we know contribute to whether a nation or community's stock of health is going up or down, and in turn, economic opportunities. And that was then published by the ONS in December. And so what this really does for the first time is look not just at health outcomes, but the sort of very breadth of what makes up the stock of health communities and how that varies across the country, so that it better picks out where we as a nation and where ministers should be investing in communities' health for today, to pay not just for health outcomes in the future, but also for prosperity and other aspects.
Mm-hmm. And the book, the idea of the book came from that 2018 report, did it? Because I think, Sally, you were a bit unusual as a CMO in not only allowing people to help you with the writing, but actually giving them some attribution, because not all your predecessors did that, I believe.
Well, I come from a research background, and I believe very strongly you should give the attribution. And then also, of course, if there's a problem, they cop it. So I would choose the subject, choose the experts, and they were experts, agree with them what chapters they were writing, but then my role was to craft that first chapter about what did this mean for policy. And every time I got a young public health registrar to work with me as the chief editor, which meant not only corralling all these writers and writing the first draft of that first chapter, but actually what I also did was pre-sell, and the editor, so Johnny, did quite a lot of this, all of the recommendations, so that the take-up and the impact was maximized.
Mm-hmm. And Johnny, I mean, I can tell you're a good writer because I just spent the whole day reading your book from well, I would say cover to cover, but I read it on an iPad, so there were no covers there. But it's very easy to read. So, I mean, you've got a good knack for writing. I'm kind of assuming you did maybe a tiny bit more of the writing than Sally, but Sally was the overseer and the inspiration. But you're also a good numbers person, I think. There's a whole lot of graphs in there, and very helpful graphs and numbers, which kind of, you know, it's pictorially it works, tells the story nicely as well as the words.
Well, thanks very much, Roger. And we worked both for the report, but then for the book really well together. And it's been a real pleasure working with Sally over the past few years. And with the book, the fun part was the discussions and the debates together. Yeah. My writing was very rough and had the numbers in. Sally was much better at making it more readable and bringing it all together. But in terms of the data, what we've actually found, and it's been really helpful to hear from friends and colleagues across health, but also those who are just generally interested in public policy, is just how actually some of those numbers in there are really quite stark and were unknown to people. So some of the statistics that we bring out to really make this point around how healthy life expectancy is so important for an individual, of course, for their happiness, but also for them to have the opportunities of health, and that being to learn, for education, to work, and to look after family. And if you take, for example, life expectancy inequalities in England, for women, the gap between the most and least deprived 10% increased from 6 to 8 years from 2000 to 2016. And for men, it's from 9 to 10 years. But that's the gap in life expectancy, how long we can live. But if you look at how many years we live in good health, so that's healthy life expectancy, that gap is double. So the women from the most deprived 10% of communities live 19 years fewer in good health than the least deprived 10%. And we really, when we came across this in the report in 2018, felt that was really shocking, and especially as it's worsening and as health plays a bigger and bigger role in people's lives and their future prosperity.
We have actually Michael Marmot, the doyen of inequalities, is talking on In Conversation in a few weeks' time. So I will be addressing quite a few of your points to him. But maybe for Sally, a question for you: why is it that poverty is so closely associated with ill health? Is it housing? Is it diet? Is it smoking? What are the reasons? And if say the government suddenly became much more beneficent and handed out a lot more money to those most deprived sections, would health necessarily increase? Would it improve? Or is it kind of embedded into, because of the difficulties with education years and years ago, that if you give them more money, they just buy more fish and chips and sweet things?
It's all of the things you've said that come together in poverty. There is higher smoking, there's higher overweight, there's more fast food outlets, so it's a worse diet. There's more binge drinking, worse housing, and all of this actually leads to more diabetes, cardiovascular disease, worse outcomes, more multimorbidity, as Johnny was talking about, and that's well known. I think one of the things that we make a big thing about is that Michael Marmot and others have talked about social determinants of health. And yes, they are now well known. The work started with Black and the Black report. Aitchison picked it up. Marmot's done a lot of very nice work, particularly the Whitehall study. But we felt that talking about determinants was just accepting they happen. And when I talked to Michael, he'd say, well, solve poverty. And I'd say, well, the CMO can't solve poverty. What are we going to do? And we think that we've got to stop talking about determinants. We talk about drivers of ill health, because they're things that as a society we can do something about. So I think one of the most awful things that I learned through doing this work, maybe Johnny knew it before, was now that health is more important for work than education, and that if you have multimorbidities, you're less likely to be in work or in a stable job. And that's dreadful. But just think about it, that a lot of the children that live in poverty have one or both parents working and they're still in poverty. So somehow, as a society, we haven't got this right. So where would you put the money? Clearly, you have to think about how you can invest through society in improving health and education, but we also have to rectify that. You shouldn't be working in proper jobs and still be in poverty.
Yes, I can see that. So, Jonathan, one of the chapters in the book, emphasizes the role of business, big business, I suppose, in creating the drivers of ill health, and I suppose the drivers of poverty too, because they're financially incentivized to sell foods full of sugar and salt and other unhealthy things, alcohol, tobacco as well. I mean, just to elaborate on that a bit, because I mean, clearly changes in taxation might be a solution to some of those things, as you point out, but just tell us a bit more about that.
Yes, well, as you say, as we transition to many of these chronic diseases that we live with, and we hear about obesity and diabetes, for example, so much, that more than 50% of deaths and 50% of chronic diseases could be avoided if we tackled poor diet, smoking, alcohol, physical inactivity, and air pollution, all of which we know what to do. And in some areas, there are the green shoots, but we're not going the full hog. So what we generally tend to find, for example, with poor diet, is that often the easiest, most accessible, and most affordable option is the unhealthy option. So at the moment, the sort of balance is very much in favor of making the unhealthy choice. And then when you look across the country in different communities, you tend to find that actually that's even more the case in the more deprived communities. So for example, taking fast food outlets, there's much higher densities of fast food outlets the poorer the community is, and even more so around primary and secondary schools. So you perhaps won't be surprised to know that the prevalence of overweight or obesity for children starting reception is twice as high in the most deprived neighborhoods as the least deprived, and that continues and even worsens by the time they leave primary school. So in terms of what to do about it, throughout the book, we talk about these negative externalities, which economists would say, how do you internalize them? So we've seen the polluter pays idea, of course, with regards to carbon and pollution. But you may recall just 2 years ago, the soft drinks industry levy, or the sugar levy, was introduced. And now there was a lot of outcry at the time that this was business bashing, it was terrible for businesses, how would they cope? But what the Treasury very cleverly did was they set thresholds so that if you reformulated your product to reduce the amount of sugar below one threshold, you paid less of a levy. And if you got below that second threshold, you didn't pay any. And the thresholds were based on the amount of sugar in each drink. And before it was even implemented, that led to 50% of all drinks reducing their sugar. Now, 2 years on, Roger, what we found is sugar is down in terms of consumption from soft drinks, but actually revenues are up. And so this is very much a win-win. So it busts the myth a bit about this being bashing business. This is around finding where we can incentivize and align those incentives. So what's good for business is also good for the nation's health.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit about the other two. I mean, we talked about fatty foods and sugary foods. Let's talk about tobacco and about alcohol. So, Sally, I think you were quite vocal in when you were CMO about alcohol, and I think some of my medical friends who probably drink too much, a little more than they ideally should, including David Spiegelhalter, I think, one of your colleagues now in Cambridge, criticised you a little bit for that, in terms of the limits of alcohol. Just tell us about, I mean, there's no question there is too much alcohol consumption in the UK, but your thoughts on that?
Well, actually, it's very interesting that the number of people in our population who don't drink at all is going up year on year, yet so is alcohol consumption. So some people are really drinking too much. And I was asked by David Cameron when he was Prime Minister to review the safe alcohol guidelines, which with the other CMOs from Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, we did, asking two groups of experts to look at this. One to do the reviews on the damage that alcohol can do and what looked like physically safe, and one on the behavioral issues. And we came out with our guidelines. And actually the science is now that men and women should have the same levels, and you should have some days when you don't drink and try and limit yourselves to 14 units a week. I think there's no doubt that at the time, Australia and Canada had very similar guidelines, and other countries who've reviewed theirs. The science is getting harder and harder, that you have to be careful about what you drink. But isn't it like smoking and seatbelts? These are norms. And so, you know, I remember when it was quite normal to drink when you were out for an evening and then drive home. And now, socially, that is not acceptable. So we do have to move the norms on and make it easy for people to take the healthy choice and unacceptable to do the unhealthy or risky behavior. And of course, not drinking and driving's risky for you, but risky for other people, just as smoking is risky for you and risky for other people.
There's a question from Alfonso Reed for you, Sally, I think, about possibility that our antibiotics will stop working due to misuse. We'll hold that for a minute. I'll go back to Jonathan, because let's finish up on, go back to tobacco. Because I remember hearing on, I think, Today program, Jonathan, one of the executives, I don't know, British American Tobacco, one of the big tobacco companies, saying, well, you know, smoking is being reduced in the UK, but, you know, we don't really care about that because the smoking in China is skyrocketing, and your British budget for tobacco is tiny compared with the Chinese. So, I mean, that sort of raises the question about, you know, a lot of your recommendations are pretty focused on the UK, but the problems are not UK alone, they're global. But let's talk about the, you know, tobacco in the UK and then globally in terms of its damage.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, with tobacco, we've seen, you know, over the last 70 years, men who came back from the Second World War, there was around 2 in 3 who were smoking. Now, across the UK generally, across men and women, it's around 15% of people who smoke. So there's been substantial declines in smoking generally over that period. And that's really due to no one policy. It's a number of policies, including the fiscal ones, such as the tax, but also the banning in public places, also the information and the support. But what that masks in the UK, for example, this big decline over the last, well, really 60, 70 years, that masks the differences. So whilst it's around 15% of everybody generally, smoking in pregnancy can vary 17-fold. So in Woking, for example, it's around 1.5% of women who will smoke during pregnancy. In Blackpool, it's around 28%. And so what that shows is that whilst we brought down the average, there's still a lot of work to do. And we need to move a little bit more from the one size fits all approach to being more specific, more targeted, supporting those who are at higher risk to stop smoking during pregnancy. And lots of that really can be leveraged internationally, as you say. So tobacco is a good example of lots of WHO work around setting frameworks around controlling tobacco. And as you say, now areas like the UK are a very small market for many of these firms compared to low and middle income countries. And certainly that's where we're seeing some of the largest growth in tobacco. And so lessons can be and are being shared internationally as to what's worked, but similarly, which populations within countries are most vulnerable and would require different or more specific and targeted support to help stop.
Whilst I've got you on the screen at the moment, tell us a little bit about your health index, because I know that's one of the main conclusions, not only of that report that you both wrote in 2018, but also the book as well. So explain that to the audience. I think it's very important.
Thanks, Roger. So the health index, which was recommended back in 2018 in Sally's report that I edited, was all based in the idea that illness we see as a cost all of the time, but actually good health is an asset. And we wanted to reposition health as an asset to the economy and to us as individuals. But despite that, we tend to just measure illness. When we look at all of the numbers, it's life expectancy, it's cancer mortality, but actually those risk factors, smoking, obesity, and so forth, and the wider determinants, so housing, access to green space, jobs, they all play a big part in predicting how our health will play out in years to come, but also the health of a community and its economic prosperity. So the health index has these three layers: health outcomes, life expectancy, cancer mortality, and that's called healthy people, and healthy lives, which are these risk factors, and healthy places, the areas around us. And what that then does is it has this composite index. We can see how it's changed over time, how it varies by place, and so which indicators, which areas we should invest in to level up health and that stock of health across the country. And the idea of it then is that you've got this unit of currency. The health index sits, as we hope, alongside GDP as a national statistic, and that the Cabinet Office can go and say to the Department for Work and Pensions or Department for Education, what are your policies doing to help our stock of health and then the economy in years to come?
It's interesting, isn't it, to think about whether being a rich nation, I'm not sure the UK post-Brexit is necessarily can be described as a rich nation. Who knows what's going to happen over the next 10 years. But say America, you know, the richest country in the world, they're not the healthiest country in the world, are they? So just getting richer as a country doesn't necessarily lead to an improvement in health. That's probably because their public health systems are even worse than ours. What would you say to that?
What's quite interesting, if you look just even at life expectancy, which is very much the end result, and we pick it up later. And so this is just as a tip of the iceberg to show what's going on underneath. So in the UK, we've seen this slowing down of life expectancy since 2010. And actually, in the most deprived 20% of women, life expectancy has gone backwards. Now, if you look over to the US, they've had 3 consecutive years where aggregate life expectancy has gone backwards. And that's the first time that's happened since World War II. And if you look over in the US, we're seeing both these deaths of despair, so things around opioids, but also alcohol and suicides, but also in more common causes of death. So in cardiovascular disease, patients with diabetes, having seen 30, 40 years of improvements with mortality constantly coming downwards, we're now seeing those starting to level up, particularly in younger adults and middle-aged adults. And that's really concerning.
That's interesting. A lot of the problems that we're talking about are public health problems, but, you know, of course, public health has been in the headlights with the COVID epidemic as never before. So the public health doctors like Chris Whitty are the most famous doctors in the UK, and nobody cares about prostate surgeons anymore. We're off the radar screen completely. But you know, in 2012, when Andrew Lansley did his reorganization, or somebody's described it as a re-disorganization, I think. Public health got moved, the funding for public health got moved from the NHS to the local council. So, I mean, was that a bad move, do you think? Was that partly responsible for some of the problems we're living with now?
No, I think parts of it were wrong, and I argued at the time anything that was a clinical service should not have gone. So STDs, contraception, drug treatments, stopping smoking treatments. I thought those should have stayed with the NHS. But I think trying to move forward on obesity and exercise, issues like that, can sit very comfortably in the local authority. And then for health protection, the NHS is already doing its work on infections, and pick up the bits if there's biosecurity issues. I mean, look at Salisbury with Novichok poisoning, how wonderfully they did. But actually, the big problems are generally in the community, and you want to link up with the environmental inspectors and the food people and all of that. And so there is a role in the community. I know we're going to reorganize it again. I really hope that we get it right. But we will need some public health supporting environmental food people and other things like that out in local authorities. And they have a very big role in mental health of school children, in anti-obesity, exercise, active travel, all of that sort of thing, greening, reducing pollution. And you need public health people to really champion that and make for the changes.
Yeah. And I guess we shouldn't blame Andrew Lansley for everything. A lot of people do, including our present health minister, I think, to some extent, because austerity was responsible. And that gives me a chance to give a plug for, we've got George Osborne, Mr. Austerity, on this show in about 3 weeks' time. So we'll be able to grill him a bit about that. There's a question here about for you, Jonathan. Are you declining poverty in a financially deprived sense, or is it limited access to opportunity? I mean, you can, I suppose, you can be poor and live in a wonderful rural setting and have a rich life, or you can be quite rich and be poor in your local circumstances, I suppose. So how do you define poverty? Is it the actual amount of money you earn, or is it broader than that?
So in terms of, it's a really good question. So in terms of poverty, when we're talking about, for example, that 1 in 2 children who are in poverty live in households with working parents, as Sally mentioned, that's with relative poverty and specific to relative poverty. But when we're talking about deprivation, we tend to refer to the index of multiple deprivation, which is a composite measure, which has various different domains in it. One includes health, one includes income domain, things like crime and what's going on in your local environment. So it's a composite measure at the postcode level that put together generally looks around deprivation of an area. Income is one of those things, but others around that. And so generally across health, and when I've been talking about the 10% most deprived versus 10% least deprived, that's using this ONS measure of index and multiple deprivation.
Yeah, so deprivation is a better word than poverty, isn't it, really, I guess. So, Sally, question for you from Mitch Blair. Thank you very much, Mitch. The pandemic's had considerable impact on health services and education for children and young people, especially around mental health. What can we do to strengthen existing community assets to support mental health?
Thank you, Mitch. I absolutely agree. I think as we go through this, the people who are losing out most are actually the children and young people. The lack of education, social interaction and opportunity is really very, very worrying. So we talk in the book about what's needed. And we start with, well, you need to measure it if something's going to happen, the National Health Index, we've mentioned it. We talk about a public health investment fund, and I'll come back to where that comes from. And then we also talk about needing the equivalent of a Bank of England, the Bank for Health, as an independent body that plays many roles, particularly using data to review and make sure things are there. And our view about the Public Health Investment Fund is we need a fund which actually invests in long-term public health. So outside the electoral cycle, looking for return on investment at 5, 10, 20 and 30 years. And that might be in breakfast clubs. I mean, Sure Start was wonderful, wasn't it? It might be in improving vaccination rates. It could be in a number of things at local, regional or national level. So how would you get such a fund is one of the questions we address, and the role of the private sector. But I'll see where Roger wants to take this.
Yeah. Well, Martin McKee's just sent in a question, and when Martin appears on our COVID series, he's one of our great communicators. He says, Sally, you were CMO to all of government. What would you ask of Treasury, the FCO, and the Home Office to build back better after the pandemic? We are in a unique situation. I'm going to come on to talk about the impact of the pandemic on universities such as wonderful Oxford and Cambridge universities too. But what are we going to build back better? What are we going to change? And I'll come over to you, Jonathan, to ask the same question in a minute. Thank you, Martin, for that question.
Thank you, Martin. And thank you also for all the advice and support you gave me as CMO. So what do we need? We need to be able to invest in the public's health. So, and the way we see it is that at the moment we have a national illness service that was set up in 1948 and has served very well to look after people who are ill effectively. And in practice, it's an insurance scheme paid for by taxation. So we need that insurance. We do need the multi-morbidity and chronic disease work to be brought together around patients much more in the community. Others have said that before. But we also need to invest. We need to invest in the public's health. We need to invest both financially with a long-term perspective on the return on investment, and we need to get everyone to invest. And so if you look at COVID, what we're seeing is the hit on the economies of individuals, of families, communities, and society as a whole, let alone the businesses. And our argument is prevention's much cheaper than cure. As my grandmother would have said, a stitch in time saves 9. And that actually we should be investing together. And so we argue we need a public health investment fund, and that should be part taxation, but part of it should come from the private sector. And we recommend an economic model of play or pay. So all businesses ought to be looking after the health of their employees and their employees' families. And if they do that well and reach out to their communities and societies, they've played. If they're not doing that well enough, then they should be contributing to a fund that can do that, the Public Health Investment Fund. And if you have the National Bank of Health, they can decide on the relative levels that people have to pay. Meanwhile, I would take the model of the sugar levy and say, and if you produce goods that are harmful, and that's how you make your profit, we are going to first of all ask you to make them as healthy as you can, less unhealthy, like the sugar levy, but we're also going to tax you and contribute again to the Public Health Investment Fund, because it's the externalities. The polluter should pay. Why should you make a bomb for your investors who are already rich probably or abroad based on damaging the health of our community? You need to repay that debt.
Yeah, so
I don't want to stop chocolate, I want to keep it. But we need to make sure that the externalities are funded.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine with Amazon, where people buy so much stuff from now, that you could have a differential tax on unhealthy things, to try and drive people towards healthier things. Jonathan, Brian Selwyn Barnett says, we've seen a general reduction in smoking and drinking, but there's not a substantial rise in drug taking and the damage that's causing. So I know you mentioned that in your book, about halfway through, if I remember, drug taking and the addictions in general. So tell us a little bit about that. I mean, that's a different problem, isn't it? And probably a harder one to crack.
Well, the addiction issues that we raise in the book, as one of the social drivers of health, are really interesting, because generally when we think within health of addiction, we think of smoking, of alcohol or drugs. But actually, as we point out in the book, it's a much broader set of conditions that affect one's health and the public's health more generally. One example, for example, is online gambling. and looking at how actually relatively quickly over the last few months that there's been an increasing awareness, particularly during this lockdown period, of actually the tactics and approaches that online gambling companies will use, often on quite vulnerable individuals without limits and without checks and balances in place. And that actually when you look at that in terms of, again, the individuals who often are at most harm from that and most vulnerable to that, is again a similar set of individuals who often can be very vulnerable to that and have poor outcomes. And so that's one area which is quite, is very much an evolving social driver, and that governments are trying to sort of keep up with, but are a bit behind again with that online sense. But in terms of alcohol and drug misuse and so forth, so we know of these deaths of despair in the US. What's interesting in the UK is we've seen some data up in Scotland, which to sort of give cause for concern around drugs, but also with alcohol. But when we've looked specifically, for example, at life expectancy over the last 20 years, as I say, what we found is that gap's got bigger amongst the different deprivation groups, but that most causes of death, mortality rates are coming down for, and that's in the general population: heart disease, cancer, heart disease coming down much quicker than cancers, but generally it's improving. There are two big exceptions to that. One is dementia. Dementia death rates are going up. Now that's in many ways a sign of public health success. We're living longer. The biggest risk factor for dementia is age. Clearly, it means we need more focus there and to ensure that social care is well joined up with health service. But the other one that we've actually seen increase in the death rates is liver disease. And we've seen this both in the general population, specifically in the more deprived groups and specifically in women, but also in cause-specific groups like those with diabetes. And it's really complex to tease out why that is, but it's likely to be a combination of increased obesity, things like diabetes, but also around different alcohol consumption patterns across different communities. So it's something that's simmering along there, and I don't think it's had enough attention at policy level, but also actually within the NHS at the moment, across those, how it clusters in different patients with lots of different risk factors, as it perhaps it should have.
Great. I've got a lovely question from Alice Doyle, who I've got a feeling she may be a medical student, but here's the question. Do you think medical students are well prepared for the changing health environment? What changes would you make to the content of medical education so that it properly emphasizes the health challenges of today? I mean, that's a lovely question, because I mean, you must have loads of medical students in Trinity. Well, they won't be there; they'll be at home with their parents at the moment, sadly for them, and we will talk about that in a minute. But Sally, I mean, you've got some brilliant messages in your book, but are they being taught to medical students?
Actually, the medics and dental students are back in all the universities.
Right.
No, I don't think they're being taught in this way. I mean, I think that the undergraduate curriculum's terrifically full and tough. Having a daughter who's an F2, I've watched her go through it, it really is tough. And they didn't get that much exposure to this sort of public health. You do need the basics of public health, but I think what is really important about what we're saying is that I came from a totally different background, yet I am totally persuaded of this. That, once you really immerse yourself in it, you realize how important this is, and that we have to work not only with individuals, but at the population level. And I think Muir Gray's pushes to work on population health, even as clinicians, is terribly important. And we need to get some of his concepts into the undergraduate career. But I don't know what we're going to drop, so don't ask me.
Do you teach undergraduates, Jonathan? You must be involved in that to some extent, or are you too much of an academic to spend time teaching?
I know some public health lectures and so forth, but I think and of course I'm sure I'll be biased with my own interests, but the two areas that strike me generally, and I'd agree with Sally, it's the difficult question is what do you drop? But that generally, if you look at our system, and it's something we talk about in the book, and that the current CMO, Chris Whitty, speaks about a lot as well, is that we tend to be single disease, single organ, single pathology focused, both in how we learn, in our systems, how the health service works, but also how we train. And generally over the last few decades, we're becoming more and more specialist, whilst the patients we see are becoming more and more diverse in their health problems. So I think there is something around taking that more multi-morbidity type of approach, looking at combination of conditions in there. The second thing, which I would say as an epidemiologist, is I think the ability to look at data and understand data and just do a little bit of interrogation of what the data is really underrated, because actually you can be fascinated by looking at your patients, looking at what it is that's bringing them to the hospitals. But then if you can just take one step outside of that and see, but what are the patterns in our community? How is that changing over time? Then you can really start to think, how can we have an even larger impact over time to make the population healthier?
Well, there's a question from Aniruddha Voruganti. She says, thank you for a fascinating talk to both of you. He or she, I can't tell, maybe she, is an Oxford medical student, and I'm hoping to pursue a career in international health policy. I was wondering if you had any advice on the best way to go about this in the coming decades, particularly with respect to the developing world. What advice would you give about a career in public health, especially global public health, for somebody like that, Oxford graduate like you?
Certainly what I've learned in my short time so far is to follow what you enjoy, and to be very much be driven by the opportunities that you find by following your passions. And really, you can't go too far wrong with that. I know that I'm regularly asked by friends and by people I meet at Imperial who are perhaps halfway through their medical training and say, oh, I'm really interested in public health or global health. I'm not sure about this clinical business. And I have to say, I learned more in my time at clinical school and in those 2 years in medicine to actually ground me to actually what we're doing in public health. And I think it's a really, really important training then, if you're on medical training, to actually take everything from each of the different jobs. And for example, in my last year of clinical work, I knew I was moving on to public health, but I had 2 very, very different jobs, which have influenced my thinking and understanding immensely since then. One was psychiatry, community psychiatry, and the other was A&E, sort of chalk and cheese in many ways. But again, really sort of impacted me in terms of looking at what those wider drivers of health are, put some faces to the types of issues we look at in epidemiology that often can just be numbers on the page, to understand what these challenges are and how they actually manifest themselves. So I think throughout your training, wherever it is you'd like to end up, really use each opportunity that presents itself, remember it, but beyond all of that, really follow whatever it is that your passion is to go forward.
Well, that sounds good advice. Sally, Andrew Hughes says, Sally, hematology to CMO to Oxford. Yeah, you're a great loss to hematology, but tell us, a little bit about that journey, and tell us. I mean, you were brought up in a era a bit like me, roughly the same era, where medicine was pretty much male dominated. So you must have had to fight to get to be like one of the very top doctors in the UK as a woman. I mean, any thoughts about that? And I was just thinking today, I mean, do we have equality now between men and women in medicine, or is there still a bias towards men?
So yes, it was quite difficult. I always felt I had to be better than the men to get a job. And there weren't many women in my year at medical school. But I'm lucky. I was brought up to be bolshy. My parents were academics, and my father was actually a theologian, and he would have theologians from around the world visit, and we were allowed to interact. And I can remember age 6 saying to some poor bishop from somewhere, how do you know God exists? I don't think he does. My father just say, go for it. So, and I did have standoffs with my consultants when I was training and say, I don't think you're right, or I disagree. But always reasonably respectful. You have to learn emotional intelligence and charm. So it was all right. I think it's very hard work, and many women, and increasingly men, take decisions about wanting to do childcare and not work ridiculous hours. And so then they choose their course. I and my husband were both pretty workaholic because we get so much fascination and interest out of it. And I always wanted to help my patients, and I loved the research, and I loved doing policy. So I find it difficult to draw distinctions, except of course when I'm on holiday, and I love holidays. It's not easy. Do I think it's equal now? Well, as I watch my daughter and the younger ones, yes. But I'm not yet sure as they get more and more senior. And in academic medicine, it looks to me as if women still have to overprove themselves. I think it's very difficult. We're all getting unconscious bias training. But you know, when I'm on an interview committee, I know who I want to appoint. It's the sparky woman. I like appointing in my own type. So of course the men want to appoint other pompous men or something, you know, it's natural. And we have to sit on those committees as women and challenge it and make sure that the best gets it. But it's not an easy job. And I think academic medicine shows we haven't got there for equality fully yet. And the Royal Colleges too. You look at the officers, the presidents, we're getting a smattering of women and they're all great. Why haven't we had them before? Why have we not got more? Is it that they don't want to do it? I bet there are plenty who do, who'd be fantastic.
I was just having lunch with Simon and our wonderful CEO, Michelle. We were talking about maybe starting some RSM debates. So, you know, have women reached equality in medicine would be a good subject for an RSM debate. We'll maybe think about that for the autumn. Okay, let's go back to you, Jonathan. Kevin Doyle's got a good question. He says, I can imagine the Daily Mail response to suggestions of increased taxes on unhealthy lifestyle choices, the nanny state curtailing our freedom. How do you get the government to be favourable to that kind of suggestion, especially if you've got, you know, boosterism in chief as our Prime Minister at the moment? That's a pretty good question.
It's a very good question and a regular one. And there's sort of two parts to the answers. One is a general and the second is giving a recent example. So generally the answer is the data, I think, in a sense, is to actually show the data as to why and what this would mean, but not just the data about health. So one of the things that was so strong about the health index recommendation and why it's been adopted and why it's of interest to ministers is because of this increasing link between the cost of ill health and the opportunity for economic prosperity of good health. And so if you look at obesity, it's a condition that often onsets in childhood at a very young age. And then that child, unless their obesity is controlled and reversed, they're on a totally different trajectory to a non-obese child going forward. Their education opportunities, their employment opportunities, they're much more likely to have in-work or sort of health-related benefits during working age. And then they're likely to have many conditions and frankly cost more to the NHS. So there's the economic argument that we make to the ministers and so forth in that. But the second one is, where are we now? So if you look over the last 10 months and the awfulness of the pandemic, sadly, the UK has done very badly when you look at excess deaths. So it's up there with either the worst or second worst excess death count in Europe. Now, there's three different groups that we look at as to why that might be. The first is the policies over the last 10 months. You know, did they lock down early enough, test and trace and things like that? But that's just one element to it. The second is the public's health when the pandemic hit. And as Sally mentioned, a healthier population with lower rates of obesity, lower rates of diabetes, less relative inequality, would have been much more resilient to shocks like the pandemic. That would have had less severe lockdowns over time, and that's better for business, better for the economy. The third area is resilience in the health and social care system, which we have tended to run on an efficiency model, which isn't best suited to health. So I think all of that pulled together really brings an opportunity to think differently and to value health differently. And when the government are looking to build back better, they were elected on a manifesto to level up. Well, those communities who they were looking to level up, they've been set back even more by the pandemic. So they're going to have to do things differently. Otherwise, they won't do very well in fulfilling that manifesto pledge.
Yeah, very good answer. Sally, I remember the Prime Minister standing on the steps of Downing Street saying that he'd got the solution to social care, that he was going to fix social care, which has been discussed, for so many years. And you point out in the book that, bringing in social care into the overall budget of the NHS may be the way forward. I mean, is that your position now that we need to fund social care properly?
Well, it needs to be funded properly. I think there are a number of ways you could go forward. And there was that excellent review by the senior economist whose name slipped my memory. I think we can go on with it funded through local authorities up to a certain point, but then we all need to contribute when it goes over that certain level, so it's properly funded. Or we pay more taxes and have it like the NHS. I don't mind which it is, but come on, this is not dignified. This is not a mature nation looking after its elders. We have to do better.
Yeah, absolutely. And was it Andrew Dilmot you were thinking
yes,
of?
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, we had him on the program a few weeks ago. Wow, fantastic guy. He came up with that wonderful TV program about costs of everything. Blocking on the name of that now. But Sally, you're the first female master of Trinity College, Cambridge, right? I mean, you must be quite proud of that. You've done lots of amazing things, but is that the most amazing, would you say?
I think being CMO was more amazing, but this is very special. We were established in 1546. I'm not only the first woman, I'm the first clinical medic. They've had biochemists and bioscientists, and I'm the first non-Trinity graduate too. All of theirs have been either Trinity graduates or Trinity fellows.
Yeah, it's
fun.
And that's your study that we can see behind you. Looks rather glorious to me.
Medieval, yes. Aren't I lucky?
And do you, I mean, medical students and dental students are back, you were saying, but everybody else, all those other students, I was watching Newsnight last night and they had some very upset students saying, oh my God, I've only got 3 years at university. I've lost a whole year. I didn't want to spend my early 20s at home with mum and dad. I mean, it is rather tragic, isn't it, for them at the moment? But is distance learning, working well in Cambridge?
I think it's dreadful for all the students. Ours tell us that they're doing pretty well at home in general on the learning, but beginning, I think this lockdown, they find it tougher socially and welfare-wise, and the anxiety and depression is, I think, beginning to rise. The ones we've got back at the moment, 25%, we're doing everything we can to make sure, because of the Kent variant, that they're masked, socially distanced, living in their households, but that we're giving them welfare support in all sorts of ways. From giving them hot chocolate and biscuits if they're confined because they're isolated, to testing them every week to see if they've got COVID, and helping them as much as we can.
I'm trying to find the question, but we've got 63 questions here and they tend to be difficult to find. But Jonathan, we're nearing the end. There's a question about transportation. I mean, that's something that you don't mention in your book. And I think you very once or twice mentioned climate change, which is going to be another driver, to use your favorite expression, for terrible ill health in the future. And transportation is a big driver of climate change. So, I mean, any thoughts about that? How do we change people's behaviour in terms of transportation?
Well, I think there's several ways, and one of them, there's a lot of research around this active travel and encouraging people, where possible, to travel in an active way, whether that's walking or cycling, and that cities obviously are a good example of that, and everything from making cycle lanes more accessible and more safe, but that often we focus on things like cycle lane, and really they often preach to the converted, and the middle-aged man in lycra is the classic example with that. And often we then miss those who have structural barriers to being able to do that, the cost of a bike and so forth. But if you look at active travel, transport and issues like that, it really speaks to how the differences and the challenges and the health profiles of populations are just so different across the country. The barriers to somebody in London using active travel more are so different to someone in rural Norfolk, for example. And this is why, very much a local approach towards health, that we've seen during the latter stages of the pandemic. But when we go forward and really trying to level up health, every population is different, and each of their challenges to healthier lifestyles, to healthier outcomes, is very different too. So there's no real one size fits all. But as you say as well, there's the link with the sustainability, of course, and that there's a lot of links between things that are better for the climate are also better for health,
and vice versa. And we pick up on a couple of areas for optimism in the book, things that we call new power. And so this is from a book a couple of years ago, the concept being social media with social purpose, social movement, social media and a purpose. And one of those, of course, is the vegan movement. People have very different purposes for becoming vegan, some for health reasons, some for the climate and so forth, but actually collectively and generally driven by the younger generation, they're actually changing the food market. They're changing the food market to be healthier. And so that's really cause for optimism, I think, looking forward.
Yeah, well, I had a burger called Beyond Meat Burger from Tesco a couple of last week. Fantastic, tasted better than a proper burger actually. So yeah, I completely agree. That was, sorry, I found the question now. It's Rowan Watson asked the question about transportation. Thanks, Rowan. Got one last question. This is for you, Sally, from Michaela Brayley. Thank you for an excellent discussion. We can't remove social media, but how can we harness it for good health and try and minimize its harms of information? That's in your book too, isn't it?
Yes, and there are various things one can do, but actually, let me pick some good things that they're doing so we end on a high. Through something that I launched last September called the Trinity Challenge, we're bringing together private sector at the highest level with academia and NGOs to work on how do we predict, prevent, respond and recover from pandemics better. And Facebook is doing these regular surveys of symptom surveys. So at Google, they share the data with academics and you can ask for them to put questions in. They're now working with Internews, which is an NGO, about how to get the proper health messages out, particularly interested in vaccine hesitancy from a trusted person using Facebook. So they're beginning to work on some of these health issues with us. When I led a cross-CMO review of social media, what we found with children was the jury is out about the harm. We know that it can be harmful if they show images of self-harm or take you into things that are criminal. But actually, there may just be an association with depression and anxiety and overuse of social media. Meanwhile, it opens up all sorts of other things. So we have to find a way to balance it all and move forward as a society. And I'm watching what Australia has set off with great interest.
Yeah, absolutely right. Well, we've got 67 questions and we've nearly had our hour now. We could go over this discussion for at least another hour, I'm sure, more than that. But don't go away because I've got a few announcements to make and then I'm going to come back with one very last question. So tomorrow on the RSM Live website, we're talking about tackling the cancer waiting list and the surgical waiting list. Our Dean Humphrey Scott's talking to Neil Mortensen, President of the Royal College of Surgeons. We've got Claire Turnbull from Imperial and Gary Middleton from the Midlands telling us about the latest data and the kind of mayhem that COVID is causing. Next Wednesday, in conversation, we've got Dame Donna Kinnair, President of the Royal College of Nursing. On the 16th of March, we're starting our very first webinar on the health emergency of climate change. And we're very pleased to say that Prince Charles himself, HRH, is going to record a video clip for us. And so we're going to have a royal introduction to the Royal Society of Medicine talking about climate change. And I think that's going to be really great. We also, on the 13th of March, Professor Baron Peter Piot, famously discovered Ebola, is giving the Jeffcott lecture. And we also, on the 25th of March, Jane McQuitty, wine correspondent of the Times, with David Glebe, is going to tell us about some amazing Australian wines. So that's on the website too. You can not only join it, you can actually order those wines. They'll be delivered free inside the M25, but you've got to drink them with extreme carefulness. Otherwise, Sally's going to go, "You naughty person." So let's just finish with one last question. Sally, with all the things you've done, I can ask you the same question, Jonathan, all the things that you've done, what are you most proud of?
Two things. Thinking Up, Making Happen, the National Institute for Health Research, and my work on antimicrobial resistance at home and all around the world.
Right.
We, between us, have changed the world.
Yeah, £1 billion for research and the antimicrobial resistance. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to talk about that. We just ran out of time. And Jonathan, just hold that book up to your computer again. I'm going to ask you what you're most proud of.
No, it doesn't have to be the book.
Okay. Come on, tell me, what are you most proud of?
It's been a fantastic pleasure and privilege working with Sally, both on the report and the book. But I think the health index, for it to be recommended and then published by the ONS, an independent statistical agency commissioned by Cabinet Secretary within 2 years, is really quite exciting. And, I'm quite excited at how it's been grasped as a way to totally reposition health. And so I'm hopeful that we can keep working on that for many years to come.
Right. Well, I think you've got a glittering career ahead of you, and I'm sure that both of you will inspire those medical students and young doctors who are watching this evening. So thank you so much, both of you. Have a great evening. And it's been really, really a pleasure and a privilege to have you on our show. Thank you so much. Oh, and the last thing to say, everybody, I nearly forgot it, is that, unfortunately, the RSM's under the cosh because our building's closed. So if you do have any spare cash and you want to make a contribution to keep us afloat, we've been around for 215 years. We need to be around for another 215. So your philanthropy, your kind donations will keep us going until this rather unpleasant COVID pandemic is over. So thank you, everybody. Good night. Have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Thank you.